40,000 troops, not in Poland, not in NATO, but in Burkina Faso, under the command of Ibrahim Traoré. And here's the irony. The West always says Africa is too weak to defend itself. Yet today, a young African leader deploys more soldiers than some European nations even have. The twist? This is not just about numbers, it's about narrative. For decades, foreign troops poured into Africa to protect. Now, Africa sends its own army to protect itself. And suddenly, the West feels threatened. Before we go further, hit that subscribe button and join us, because Africa's story deserves to be heard in your feed, not buried at the bottom of someone else's headline. And I want to ask you personally, where are you watching from today? Drop it in the comments. Tell us your country, maybe even your own habit when big news breaks. Do you grab your morning coffee, scroll on your phone, or sit back with the TV? We'd love to hear your experience. This is Africa Daily Good News, a channel built not to echo Washington or Paris, but to amplify Africa's own voice, while still connecting with viewers across America, across the diaspora, and across Europe. And now, let's dive in. Because what Traoré just did is not only shaking borders, it's shaking assumptions. 40,000 soldiers on the move inside Burkina Faso. That number alone is enough to make anyone stop scrolling. In a country often portrayed as small and fragile, suddenly we see a mobilization that rivals mid-sized European armies. Ibrahim Traoré didn't just announce another security reform, he sent a signal so loud it reached Paris, Washington, and every capital in West Africa. The official reason is straightforward: to seal the northern border from armed groups that cross back and forth with weapons and money. African news outlets describe it as the largest single deployment in Burkina Faso's modern history, and military analysts quietly admit that no West African government has pulled something this bold in decades. Yet here lies the paradox. When NATO moves troops, it's called strategic. When an African state does the same, it's framed as dangerous. And maybe this is where storytelling meets reality. Imagine a farmer in the Sahel who has seen militants burn his crops 3 years in a row. Suddenly, he sees uniformed soldiers standing guard on the same road where bandits once set up checkpoints. For him, those 40,000 troops are not numbers. They are the difference between fleeing again or finally planting in peace. Most Americans never think of soldiers as protectors of farmland, but in Burkina Faso, that's the daily calculation. There's also a hidden irony. Just last week, Poland deployed almost the exact same number of troops to its own border. Western newspapers praise the move as defensive and necessary. Yet when Traoré does it, the language flips. Authoritarian, militarization, cause for concern. What if the real concern is not about soldiers at all, but about sovereignty? After all, people tend to judge based on habit. Many Americans, according to surveys, support a strong military presence abroad because they see it as normal. But when the same habit appears in Africa, the instinct is to call it abnormal. It shows how perception, not facts, shapes the narrative. And if human beings can reframe what's normal once, they can do it again. I remember one story from the town of Kaya, where a teacher told reporters he dismissed his class early because children could hear gunfire outside the village. Weeks later, after troops arrived, he said the same children walked to school without glancing over their shoulders. That's not geopolitics. It's everyday life shifting from fear to something closer to dignity. And here comes the subtle twist. Maybe this deployment is not only about Burkina Faso's border, but also about drawing a line in the sand for Africa's future. Because when a young leader dares to act with this scale, it forces everyone else, neighbors and Western powers alike, to rethink their assumptions. The question now is not only what 40,000 troops can achieve, but what they symbolize inside a nation once written off as fragile. Because sometimes the loudest change is not in the sound of marching boots, but in the quiet shift of how people begin to see themselves. Volunteers lined up in Ouagadougou long before the sun came up. That image alone unsettled Western observers. In a country often described as poor and dependent, the recruitment drive filled faster than officials expected. Thousands raised their hands not because of money, there wasn't much offered, but because they believed the moment demanded it. For Ibrahim Traoré, this was not only a military deployment. It was proof that Burkina Faso still has citizens willing to trade comfort for sovereignty. Africa news outlets reported that stadiums were crowded with applicants. Young men carried old school certificates to prove age. Farmers walked in from villages with nothing but their sandals, and even students came with backpacks still full of books. This wave of participation unsettled analysts because it hinted at something harder to measure than numbers: legitimacy. After all, armies can be trained, but spirit cannot be borrowed. And here comes the paradox. When the United States sees a surge of volunteers during war, it is praised as patriotism. Yet when Africans do the same, headlines often warn of militarization. What if the real fear is not the size of the army, but the idea of citizens believing in it? There's also the human layer. Imagine a student who once dreamed of leaving for Europe, suddenly choosing to stay and enlist. That decision tells you something about how narratives shift. Many Americans, according to surveys, see the military as a pathway to college or stability. In Burkina Faso, volunteering is not about a degree or a paycheck. It is about making sure your village survives to see the next harvest. I recall a short story from Bobo Dioulasso. A father watched his son put on a uniform for the first time, and instead of fear, he smiled. "At least now," he said, "my son fights for us, not for them." Those words cut through the statistics. They reveal why thousands felt the call was not an order from above, but a choice from within. The hidden irony is sharp. Western analysts often argue that young Africans are disengaged, restless, ready to migrate. But here we see the opposite. Young people standing in line for hours just to sign their names for a fight most outsiders can't even imagine. If people can reverse their instincts so quickly, maybe the real lesson is that motivation changes when dignity is on the line. And beneath all this, a quiet truth lingers. An army built on volunteers is not only stronger in numbers, it is harder to dismiss as illegitimate. That reality is what worries foreign capitals more than any rifle. The mood on the ground carried a strange mix of pride and tension. Pride because thousands felt seen, tension because everyone knows mobilization carries risks. And in that delicate balance, between hope and uncertainty, the story naturally turns toward how neighbors and foreign powers respond when Africa asserts its will. Silence in regional capitals often speaks louder than official statements. And that silence has been deafening since Ibrahim Traoré moved 40,000 troops to the border. ECOWAS, usually quick to condemn or threaten, avoided direct words. France, once omnipresent in Burkina Faso's affairs, has been reduced to whispers and unnamed concerns. Yet everyone knows they are watching, because when Africa acts boldly, hesitation elsewhere is never just coincidence. Africa news reporters note that neighboring governments are split. Some quietly admire the show of sovereignty, while others worry that this scale of mobilization could spill across their borders. West Africa politics has long been managed by outside powers, but Traoré's move disrupted that rhythm. Instead of waiting for Paris or Washington to set the tone, he set it himself. And that reversal unsettles those used to Africa asking, not acting. Here lies a subtle twist. The West frames such deployments as instability, yet instability is exactly what ordinary Burkinabe felt for years without soldiers on the ground. Which is more destabilizing? Empty villages abandoned to militants, or citizens finally standing with a state that defends them? Many Americans often think of instability as political headlines. In Burkina Faso, instability means not knowing if your child will come home from the fields. I remember one story from the border town of Dori. A shopkeeper said he once closed early every evening because bandits controlled the road after dark. Weeks after the deployment, he told a journalist, he was keeping the lights on past midnight. That detail may sound small to outsiders, but it marks a shift from fear to routine. The kind of shift that turns survival into something resembling normal life. And maybe this is the quiet power that foreign governments fear most. Not the rifles, not the uniforms, but the possibility that people begin to trust their own institutions. Because if citizens believe, they stop depending on outsiders. If that pattern repeats across Africa, the entire balance of power changes. The irony is sharp. Western analysts warn that Africa's militarization threatens democracy, yet the same critics rarely mention that NATO expanded its footprint after every crisis. By that logic, one must ask, is it only democracy when power flows through Paris, London, or Washington? Or can sovereignty itself be a form of democracy when people stand behind it? Humans, if given the choice, often prefer control over dependency. According to studies in the US, most citizens say they trust their local police more than distant federal agencies. The same psychology applies here. Burkinabe trust soldiers they see in their streets more than promises from officials in New York or Brussels, and this reality creates tension that no official statement can resolve. Pride on one side, suspicion on the other, but both sides know the ground has shifted. What started as a troop movement now echoes as a political earthquake. So when the dust of silence settles, the real question is whether these 40,000 soldiers become a wall that isolates Burkina Faso, or a symbol that connects Africa to a new sense of self. And in that ambiguity, the story doesn't end. It only deepens. If you've made it this far, tell us in the comments. Do you think sovereignty is strengthened by force or by trust? Your perspective matters, because Africa's story is no longer distant. It's tied to the same debates every society faces when security collides with freedom. The atmosphere now carries both weight and momentum, and that feeling naturally pulls us toward the next layer, where economics, resources, and the cost of protection step into the spotlight. Gold guarded by soldiers instead of foreigners. That image flips history on its head. For decades, Burkina Faso's mines were seen as open vaults for companies tied to Paris and Toronto. Now, Ibrahim Traoré links the deployment of 40,000 troops not just to security, but to protecting resources that for too long flowed outward while poverty stayed home. Africa news outlets highlight how his speeches tied defense directly to sovereignty, reminding citizens that borders are not just lines in the sand, but shields around the country's wealth. And here comes the contradiction. When France sent soldiers to guard uranium in Niger, Western analysts called it strategic partnership. When Burkina Faso sends its own to guard gold, it is framed as nationalism or even isolation. The double standard is so visible it barely needs pointing out, but it raises a deeper question. Is sovereignty accepted only when it benefits the West? A short story brings this closer to reality. In a mining town outside Ouagadougou, workers once complained their wages were stuck while foreign trucks carried shipments through the night. Weeks after soldiers arrived, one miner told a local reporter he felt for the first time that maybe this gold will touch our children's future. His words reveal a shift that statistics rarely capture, the sense that protection is not abstract but personal. Humans, if given the chance, naturally defend what they believe is theirs. Most Americans, according to surveys, say they would guard their property themselves if police response times were too slow. The same instinct applies here. Burkinabe see troops around their mines and assume their resources might finally serve local schools and hospitals rather than offshore accounts. And if dignity can reshape behavior in one generation, it can also rewire expectations across a continent. There's also a hidden twist in perception. Investors warn that militarization could scare away business, but history shows the opposite can also be true. Stability, even if imposed by soldiers, often attracts buyers who prefer predictability over profit margins. What if the real gamble is not about whether troops chase investors away, but whether they force investors to negotiate on Africa's terms? The mood now carries both tension and pride. Tension because the stakes are high. Resources have always drawn conflict. Pride, because for once, Africans are the ones deciding who stands guard. And as these emotions intertwine, the story naturally drifts toward the battlefield of narratives, where foreign headlines and local voices collide over who defines freedom. Headlines in Paris screamed militarization, while TV panels in Washington warned of authoritarian drift. Yet the facts on the ground were simple. Ibrahim Traoré deployed troops inside his own borders. The irony is striking. The United States maintains military bases in more than 80 countries. France, even after being expelled from Burkina Faso, still stations soldiers across West Africa. But the moment an African leader moves soldiers within his own territory, the narrative flips into alarm. And that's where perception matters more than action. News outlets describe the same reality with different tones depending on who acts. When NATO expands deployments, it is branded as necessary defense. When Africa does it, the label becomes a threat. This double standard doesn't just reveal bias, it shapes how ordinary people, both in Africa and abroad, interpret the meaning of sovereignty. Here's a twist that few admit. The more Western media calls Traoré's moves authoritarian, the more local citizens rally behind him. Because humans, if pushed, often defend what outsiders criticize. Many Americans show the same instinct. According to surveys, when foreign governments criticize U.S. policy, public support for that policy often increases. It's a reminder that pride and identity can weigh heavier than analysis. A short story illustrates this. In Ouagadougou, a young shop owner hung a photo of Traoré in his store window after reading an article that called the deployment reckless. When asked why, he said, "If they hate it so much, maybe it means he's doing something right." That response captures something no statistic can measure: the power of opposition to create unexpected unity. And beneath this lies a broader human truth. People prefer to criticize their own leaders in private, but defend them fiercely against outsiders. It's the same way a family may argue at home, but close ranks when someone else insults them. In this sense, Burkina Faso is acting like any community under pressure, and that dynamic may explain why criticism from abroad only strengthens Traoré's image at home. The tension grows here. Outside voices insist democracy is under threat, while inside voices insist dignity is finally being restored. Both cannot be true at once, yet both shape how the story is told. And as this clash of narratives intensifies, the question shifts from politics to something more human. How far can one young leader push before history itself bends around him? The air feels heavier now, and that weight naturally leads us to the final measure. Not just soldiers or headlines, but the scale of history that judges whether this was courage or overreach. 40,000 troops standing guard in one of the poorest nations on Earth. That contrast alone shocks the imagination. For decades, Burkina Faso was described in reports as fragile, weak, dependent. Yet now, its young leader has orchestrated the largest troop movement in the country's history. Analysts admit that few governments in West Africa have ever dared to marshal such force at once, and even fewer have linked it so openly to the language of sovereignty. And here's where perception twists the story. To outsiders, it looks like militarization. To many Burkinabe, it looks like survival finally taking shape in uniform. Humans often redefine their normal when fear is replaced by presence. Most Americans, for example, say they feel safer seeing local police cars in their neighborhood at night, even if crime statistics haven't changed. In Burkina Faso, villagers now describe sleeping through the night for the first time in years, simply because soldiers are near. One story from the Sahel captures it. A mother told a radio host she used to hide her children under the bed whenever gunfire cracked in the distance. Weeks after the deployment, she said the only sound at night was crickets. That shift, from terror to routine, isn't just news. It's the measure of whether an army is feared or embraced. And yet, another twist emerges. The same movement that inspires hope at home triggers unease abroad. Western analysts warn of a strongman consolidating power, while citizens on the ground call it liberation. Both voices echo across headlines, but only one lives with the consequences daily. And maybe this is the larger point. Sovereignty is never decided in op-eds. It is decided in villages, markets, and homes. If people can redefine fear into trust in such a short span, what else can be redefined? Perhaps democracy itself, perhaps the meaning of independence, perhaps even Africa's place in global politics. After all, nations are not only shaped by laws, but by the stories people tell when the noise fades. The sight of tens of thousands in uniform on dusty roads is more than a military fact. It is a mirror, showing Africa what it can be when hesitation turns into action. And as that mirror grows clearer, the next image is no longer about soldiers, but about how history chooses to remember the leader who put them there. 40,000 soldiers on the border, yet not a single foreign flag among them. That image alone unsettles the old order. For years, Burkina Faso was portrayed as a country dependent on outsiders for its survival. Now the world sees the opposite, a young leader making the largest military move in the nation's history without asking permission. And here comes the irony. Western governments argue that such actions threaten stability, yet stability was absent long before this deployment. Villages burned, families displaced, schools shut down. What changed was not the threat, it was the response. Humans often measure safety not in statistics, but in presence. Most Americans, for instance, say they feel calmer seeing a patrol car outside their home, even if crime is no lower. In Burkina Faso, that same instinct applies to columns of soldiers on dusty roads. A short story from the north makes this real. A shopkeeper recalled closing his stall before sunset for years, fearing bandits would strike after dark. Weeks after the deployment, he kept his stall open past midnight, selling tea to soldiers and neighbors alike. That one decision turned fear into economy and silence into community. But here lies the twist beneath the twist. What inspires hope inside Burkina Faso stirs anxiety outside it. Analysts call it authoritarian. Citizens call it liberation. Perhaps both views are true in their own context, but only one side lives with the daily stakes. And maybe that is what history often forgets, that power is judged differently by those who hold the pen and those who carry the burden. If people can shift from hiding children under beds to walking freely at night, then narratives can shift just as quickly. The question is whether this moment becomes a chapter of overreach or a chapter of awakening. And that judgment won't be written in think tanks or parliaments. It will be written in the choices of farmers, students, and shopkeepers who decide whether to trust their state or turn away. The sight of tens of thousands in uniform is therefore more than a headline. It is a reminder that sovereignty is not an abstract word, but a lived experience. And as the dust settles over Burkina Faso's borders, the story of Ibrahim Traoré moves from today's breaking news into tomorrow's history book, where it will be remembered not for the noise it caused abroad, but for the silence it ended at home.